Child? Not mine, he sneered. 3 years later, the Millionaire CEO sat down to dinner, and the cook in the kitchen was his ex, raising the daughter with his blue eyes. The office smelled faintly of leather and polished wood, the kind of place designed to remind visitors of wealth and power. Alexander Reed sat behind his massive desk, his blue eyes fixed on the woman standing across from him. His dark brown hair was perfectly styled, his light gray suit pressed without a wrinkle, and his posture carried the confidence of a man who believed he controlled every room he entered. Emma clutched the ultrasound photo in her trembling hands, her chestnut hair falling forward as she struggled to steady her breath. She had rehearsed this moment so many times, imagined him softening, imagined his arms around her, imagined him choosing them. With cautious hope, she placed the picture on the desk between them. For a brief moment his gaze flicked down to it, and something unreadable crossed his face, but it disappeared almost instantly. His lips curled into a thin, cold smile that never reached his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, exuding an air of detachment, and the silence stretched long enough for Emma's stomach to twist. Finally he spoke, his voice calm but cutting, the tone of a man delivering a business verdict rather than facing the reality of a child. A child? Not mine, he said, the words dropping heavily into the space between them. Emma's throat burned as she tried to respond, but the lump in her chest stole her voice. She stared at him in disbelief, her brown eyes filling with tears. "How can you say that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Alexander, look at it. This is your child." But he shook his head slowly, as though her pain was little more than a nuisance. He reached across the desk, picked up the ultrasound, and without hesitation tore it cleanly down the middle. The sound of paper ripping echoed in the quiet office like a cruel declaration. He dropped the pieces onto the desk and leaned forward with a final, dismissive glance. "You need to let this go," he said, his tone firm, almost impatient. "I don't want this, and I won't allow it to derail my life. Whatever you think you're holding on to, forget it. Move on." Emma staggered back as though struck, her hands trembling at her sides. Her chest rose and fell quickly, and for a moment she thought her legs might give out. She searched his face for any trace of the man she had once loved, the man she believed capable of compassion, but all she found was an impenetrable wall of cold resolve. Her heart cracked under the weight of his rejection. She wanted to scream at him, to beg him, to shake him until he understood, but no sound left her lips. She turned toward the door, each step unsteady, her vision blurred by tears she refused to let him see. Behind her, Alexander remained at his desk, already pulling a file toward him, his focus shifting back to business as though the moment had been nothing more than an interruption in his day. The contrast was unbearable. She stepped into the hallway, her body trembling, her mind reeling with the enormity of what had just happened. The ultrasound was gone, destroyed, but the life inside her remained. She was alone now, and she knew with aching clarity that her world had just been split apart forever. The apartment was small and dim, its walls thin enough that the sounds of neighbors drifted through at all hours, but for Emma it had become both a refuge and a cage. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, one hand resting protectively on her stomach, the other pressed against her face to hold back the sobs that threatened to escape. The echo of Alexander's words still rang in her mind, cruel and dismissive, as though the life growing inside her was nothing more than an inconvenience. She wanted to erase the memory, but each flutter within her body reminded her of the truth he had tried to destroy. She was carrying his child, and no denial could change that. Every day was a battle between fear and determination. The doctors had confirmed what she hadn't expected: she was young and healthy, but the pregnancy was already more complicated than most. They warned her of the risks, the exhaustion, the strain it would put on her body. They told her she needed rest and support, but support was something she no longer had. She returned home from appointments with a folder of instructions and no one to share them with, no hand to hold when the weight of it all became unbearable. In the evening she cooked simple meals from whatever she could afford, often skipping her own portions so she could save more for the days when she knew she wouldn't be able to work. Her parents lived in another state, but distance was not the true barrier between them. They had disapproved of her choices long before Alexander entered the picture, and Emma could not bring herself to face their judgment now. To admit what had happened, to explain that the man she had trusted had turned his back on her and their unborn child, was a humiliation she was not ready to endure. Her friends had drifted away as well, busy with their own lives, unable to understand the silence Emma wrapped around herself. The loneliness was sharp and suffocating, but it was better than pity. Still, there were moments that broke through the heaviness. The first time she heard the tiny heartbeat during an appointment, she sat in the sterile exam room with tears streaming down her cheeks, overwhelmed by the sound. It was rapid and fragile, yet stronger than she had imagined, a reminder that she was not truly alone. At night, when fear pressed hardest against her, she would lie down and whisper to the child growing inside her, promises she had no idea how to keep. She promised safety, love, and a future brighter than the one she faced now. The words were shaky, but speaking them gave her strength. The weeks stretched into months, and her body began to show the weight of what she carried. Her ankles swelled after long shifts in the kitchen, her back throbbed from hours spent standing over hot stoves, and sleep often eluded her as the worries of tomorrow filled her mind. Yet with every kick, every movement inside her, she felt a spark of resilience. She told herself that no matter how cruel Alexander's rejection had been, she would not let his absence define the child's life. She would endure every hardship, sacrifice every comfort, and face every lonely night if it meant giving her baby a chance to thrive. The apartment might have been small and the future uncertain, but within her was a purpose stronger than fear. She was no longer living just for herself. She was carrying a piece of her past and a fragile hope for her future, and she swore that nothing, not even the man who had abandoned them, would take that away from her. The night of the birth arrived like a storm, sudden and merciless, pulling Emma into its current before she had time to prepare herself. The hospital room was harshly lit, its sterile smell clinging to her senses as waves of pain coursed through her body, each one stronger than the last. Sweat drenched her forehead, her hair plastered against her face as she gripped the side rails of the bed until her knuckles turned white. The nurses moved quickly around her, their voices urgent but calm, guiding her through each contraction with words she could barely process. Emma had known this would be difficult, but nothing could have prepared her for the sheer force of it, the way her body seemed to be breaking apart while her mind teetered on the edge of exhaustion and panic. Hours passed like minutes and centuries all at once. She screamed, cried, prayed, and clenched her teeth until finally, amidst the chaos, she heard it, the first fragile cry of her child. The sound pierced through the fog of pain, sharp and pure, and instantly her chest swelled with a surge of love so intense it made her dizzy. The doctor announced it was a girl, and in that moment Emma's world shifted forever. She caught a glimpse of a tiny, wrinkled face, a body so impossibly small yet so undeniably alive, and she knew everything she had endured had led her to this moment. When the nurse placed the baby against her chest, Emma felt the weight of her daughter for the first time. The little one's skin was warm, her movements restless but delicate, her small mouth searching instinctively. Emma wept openly now, her tears falling onto the baby's soft brown hair, whispering broken words of gratitude and wonder. She looked down into the newborn's eyes, a startling shade of blue that mirrored Alexander's so perfectly it made her breath catch. For an instant she thought of him, of the cruelty of his denial, of the ultrasound torn apart as if it were meaningless, and yet here in her arms was the living proof of what he had rejected. The ache of that memory lingered, but it could not overshadow the fierce love blooming inside her. She named her daughter Lillian, speaking the name aloud as though binding it to the child's soul. It felt right, strong and graceful, a name that carried hope for a future brighter than the shadows that had preceded her birth. As she whispered it again, she promised her daughter that she would never be alone, that she would fight through every hardship to give her a life filled with safety and love. The exhaustion in her body was overwhelming, her muscles trembling from the ordeal, but holding Lillian brought a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The room quieted after the chaos, the monitors beeping steadily, the nurses retreating to give her a moment of peace. Emma closed her eyes briefly, pressing her cheek against her daughter's head, inhaling the scent of new life, raw and pure. For the first time in months, the fear that had haunted her seemed to loosen its grip. She no longer felt abandoned, because in her arms was someone who belonged entirely to her. She had carried this child through loneliness, despair, and pain, and now that she was here, Emma knew she could endure anything. The world outside remained uncertain, but within this small hospital room, cradling her newborn daughter, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a fragile, undeniable sense of hope. The first years with Lillian unfolded like a relentless trial, every day demanding more of Emma than she thought she could possibly give. Their apartment was cramped and modest, with peeling paint on the walls and a draft that crept through the windows in winter, but it became the center of Emma's world. She woke before sunrise to prepare for her early shift at a local diner, dressing quickly and quietly so as not to wake her daughter. When she came home in the afternoon, exhausted from hours on her feet, she would scoop Lillian into her arms, pressing her cheek to the child's soft hair and inhaling the faint, comforting scent that reminded her why she kept going. Money was always tight, every paycheck stretched to its limits. She learned to live with constant worry, to calculate every expense down to the smallest coin, and to sacrifice her own needs for her daughters. There were nights when Emma would skip dinner so Lillian could have a full plate, brushing off her hunger with the lie that she wasn't in the mood to eat. Despite the fatigue that hung heavy on her body, she took extra shifts whenever possible, returning home past midnight and forcing herself awake just hours later. Sleep became a rare luxury, but whenever she looked into Lillian's blue eyes, so bright and trusting, Emma found a reservoir of strength she hadn't known she had. The girl was growing quickly, her brown hair curling slightly at the ends, her laughter filling the apartment with a kind of light that even poverty couldn't dim. She had a curious nature, forever reaching for the world around her, and Emma marveled at how such innocence could survive in such harsh conditions. Yet with every milestone, the first steps, the first words, the first time Lillian called her "mommy," Emma felt the ache of what was missing. She could not erase the knowledge that Alexander had chosen absence over presence, that he had denied this child before she even had the chance to breathe. At times she felt her anger rise like fire, hot and consuming, but she buried it deep so her daughter would never see her bitterness. To cope, Emma built routines that kept their fragile lives steady. Mornings were filled with quick breakfasts of oatmeal or toast, afternoons with trips to the park where Lillian could run freely while Emma watched from a worn wooden bench. In the evenings, no matter how tired she was, Emma read her daughter bedtime stories, her voice soft and melodic even when her eyelids threatened to close. Lillian loved fairy tales, especially the ones about lost princesses who were found again, and though Emma sometimes had to fight back tears, she told the stories as if she believed in them too. There were darker nights when Lillian would ask about her father. The questions came innocently, often after seeing another child with both parents at the park or hearing a family mentioned in a storybook. Emma's chest would tighten each time, the answer heavy on her tongue, but she never told her daughter the truth. Instead, she offered vague reassurances, promising that one day she would understand more. Alone in the quiet hours, Emma cried silently into her pillow, torn between rage at Alexander and sorrow for the gap he had left in their lives. Still, despite the struggles, there was joy in the small things. The warmth of Lillian's hand clutching hers as they crossed the street, the way she giggled when Emma spun her around in the living room, the proud smile she gave when she mastered a new word or skill. These moments were fragile lifelines, proof that love could grow even in hardship. Emma knew the road ahead would not get easier, but she also knew she would never abandon her daughter the way Alexander had abandoned them both. In Lillian's laughter, in her blue-eyed gaze, she found both the weight of her sacrifice and the reason it was worth enduring. The restaurant buzzed with the sound of clinking glasses and murmured conversations, the air heavy with the aromas of roasted meat, garlic, and fresh herbs. Emma stood in the kitchen, her apron already smudged with flour and oil, her hair tied back beneath a chef's cap as she worked quickly at the stove. The rhythm of her hands had become second nature over the years, the precision of her knife against the cutting board, the constant awareness of time and temperature. Yet behind her practiced movements, her mind was never far from Lillian, who sat quietly in the corner of the kitchen with a small coloring book, her legs swinging as she hummed a tune. Bringing her daughter to work was not ideal, but Emma had no one to watch her that night, and the restaurant owner, seeing her desperation, had reluctantly allowed it. Out in the dining room, the crowd shifted as a man and a woman entered, drawing curious glances. Alexander Reed carried himself with the same confidence he always had, his tailored suit fitting him like armor, his brown hair styled meticulously, his blue eyes scanning the room as though everything in it belonged to him. Beside him walked Julia, his current girlfriend, a striking blonde with icy blue eyes who radiated the polished grace of someone who thrived in the spotlight. They were seated at one of the best tables near the window, where the city lights spilled in, and a waiter hurried to attend to them, offering wine lists with exaggerated courtesy. Emma did not notice them at first, too consumed by her orders, but when she stepped briefly out of the kitchen to deliver a finished dish to a server, her eyes caught a familiar profile. Her breath stalled in her chest, her body freezing as if the ground beneath her had vanished. Alexander sat less than 20 feet away, leaning slightly toward Julia with a smile that looked rehearsed, his voice carrying just enough for Emma to hear the cadence without the words. Time seemed to fold in on itself, dragging her back to that office, to the sound of tearing paper, to the way his cold gaze had cut her apart. Her hands trembled, and for a moment she thought she might drop the plate she held. She forced herself to retreat back into the kitchen, pressing against the counter for support as her chest tightened. Her heart pounded so violently she was afraid the others might hear it. She glanced at Lillian, who looked up from her coloring with innocent curiosity, her blue eyes so striking against her brown hair. Emma's throat constricted as she realized what Alexander would see if his gaze shifted in the right direction. She wanted to shield her daughter, to hide her away, but it was too late. Out in the dining room, Alexander's laughter stilled when his eyes wandered toward the kitchen. His gaze locked on Emma, and the color drained from his face. For a moment he did not move, his hand frozen on the stem of his wine glass, his carefully built world cracking at the edges. Julia noticed his sudden stillness and followed his eyes, her expression tightening when she saw Emma in her chef's whites. "Do you know her?" Julia asked, suspicion lacing her tone. Alexander did not answer, his attention shifting to the small figure beside Emma. Lillian had come closer to the doorway, clutching her crayon, her wide blue eyes meeting his across the room. The recognition struck him like a blow. He saw himself in her gaze, a mirror he could not deny, and in that instant the memory of his words, "Child? Not mine," came back to him with brutal clarity. His chest tightened, shame and disbelief flooding through him, drowning out the noise of the restaurant and the chatter of his companion. Julia was speaking again, sharp and impatient, but her voice faded to nothing. All he could see was Emma, her face pale but resolute, and the little girl whose existence shattered the lie he had clung to for 3 long years. Emma, sensing his stare, pulled Lillian gently back toward her, her hand trembling as she rested it on her daughter's shoulder. She refused to look away, though every instinct screamed at her to run. The room felt unbearably small, the weight of the past pressing down on her, the life she had built with so much pain and sacrifice now colliding violently with the man who had denied it. The plates clattered, the waiters rushed, the guests laughed and drank, but for Emma and Alexander the world had narrowed to this single moment, charged and inescapable. Alexander lingered in the dining room long after the plates had been cleared, his wine untouched and Julia's irritated whispers fading into the background of his thoughts. He could not take his eyes off the kitchen doorway, where Emma had disappeared with the little girl who carried his own blue eyes. Every attempt Julia made to pull his attention back only deepened the pit of guilt gnawing at his chest, and eventually she pushed back her chair with a huff, excusing herself to make a phone call. Left alone at the table, Alexander sat rigid, the image of the child burned into his mind, her gaze both innocent and accusing. He realized that no amount of denial or arrogance could erase what had been laid before him. When Julia stepped outside, he rose slowly, his legs stiff as though the weight of his own choices had finally settled on his body. Crossing the room, he paused at the edge of the kitchen where the swinging doors let out bursts of clattering dishes and the smell of roasted garlic. Through the narrow window he caught sight of Emma again. She was bent over Lillian, whispering something to her, her hand brushing the child's hair back with tenderness. The sight made his throat tighten in a way he hadn't felt in years. Gathering a courage that felt foreign to him, he pushed the door open. The kitchen quieted when he stepped inside, the other staff glancing curiously before turning back to their tasks. Emma stiffened immediately, her back straightening, her jaw tightening as she turned to face him. She looked exactly as he remembered, though weariness lingered in the shadows under her eyes, and a quiet strength radiated from her in a way it hadn't before. Lillian clung to her apron, half hidden, peeking out at him with the shy curiosity of a child meeting a stranger. Alexander's voice faltered as he tried to speak, the words catching in his throat. "Emma, is she?" His eyes flicked down to the child and back to Emma, every ounce of practiced confidence stripped away. Emma held Lillian close, her expression like steel. Her voice was steady but cold, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Yes. She's your daughter. 3 years ago you looked me in the eyes and told me she wasn't yours. You tore her first proof of life in half and left me to carry her alone. And now you see her standing here, with your eyes staring back at you, and you still need to ask." Her words struck him harder than he had expected, the contempt in her tone leaving no space for excuses. Alexander's chest constricted, and for a moment he felt truly breathless. He dropped his gaze to the floor, shame radiating through him, but when he looked back up, his eyes met Lillian's again. The little girl tilted her head, studying him with the frankness of a child who sensed something but could not understand it fully. In her innocent stare he saw both the proof of his betrayal and the chance at redemption, though he doubted he deserved it. He took a step forward, but Emma's sharp glance froze him in place. "Don't come closer," she warned, her voice low and firm. "You don't get to step into her life just because you've finally been forced to see what you turned away from. You had your chance, and you chose to walk away." Her words were steady, but he caught the faint quiver in her hand as she smoothed her daughter's hair. It was not fear that trembled there but the exhaustion of someone who had carried far too much alone. The silence stretched, heavy with everything unsaid. The clatter of pots and pans returned in the background, but for Alexander, the world had narrowed to Emma and the child beside her. His lips parted, desperate to offer something, anything, that could soften the years of absence, but the truth was brutal, nothing he could say would erase the past. All he managed was a broken whisper. "I was wrong." Emma's eyes hardened, though her arms tightened protectively around Lillian. "You don't get to say that now and expect it to matter," she said, her voice like ice. "Go back to your table, Alexander. Finish your dinner with your perfect new life. Leave us the way you left us before. Her dismissal cut deep, but he did not move right away. He stood there for several long moments, his heart pounding, before finally forcing himself to turn back toward the dining room. The weight of her words clung to him with every step. For the first time in years, he felt stripped bare, no longer the invincible man in a suit but a hollow shell confronted with the truth of what he had thrown away. As the kitchen door swung closed behind him, the sound of his daughter's small voice echoed in his memory, though she had spoken no words. It was her eyes that haunted him, her silent presence reminding him that some truths could never be ignored again. That night Alexander lay in bed beside Julia, but his mind was far from her. The glow of the city poured through the glass walls of his penthouse, reflecting off the polished surfaces and expensive art, yet none of it brought him comfort. Julia's voice droned on about a party they had been invited to, about clothes she wanted to buy and people she wanted to impress, but her words dissolved into meaningless noise. His thoughts replayed the image of a little girl with chestnut hair and eyes as blue as his own, clinging to Emma's apron as though it were her only shield in the world. The way Emma's voice had cut through him, calm but merciless, lingered in his ears. He shifted beneath the silk sheets, restless, while Julia turned away with an annoyed sigh, muttering about his inattentiveness. Sleep never came. When dawn arrived, Alexander rose before the sun, drawn to the wide mirror that spanned one wall of his bedroom. The reflection staring back at him was flawless on the surface, every detail of his appearance sculpted and refined, yet the face itself felt foreign. His blue eyes, once sharp with certainty, now carried shadows he could not ignore. He pressed his palms to the counter, staring at himself as fragments of memory surged, Emma standing in his office with the ultrasound, her trembling voice as she begged him to see, the sound of paper ripping beneath his hands. He had convinced himself he had been right, that he was too young, too ambitious, that children would destroy everything he was building. But the truth was simpler and crueler, he had been a coward. The following days at the office were unbearable. His assistants handed him contracts and reports, his board pressed for decisions, yet every time he tried to focus, he saw Lillian's eyes staring at him. His signature faltered on the page, his concentration slipped during meetings, and soon his colleagues began to whisper about his distraction. Julia grew impatient, demanding to know why he was so withdrawn. When he finally admitted the truth one evening, her expression hardened instantly. She set her glass of wine down with a sharp clink and told him plainly that she had no interest in being entangled with children. She had chosen him for his wealth, his influence, and the image of power he represented, not to step into the life of a man with hidden baggage. The argument ended with her storming out, her perfume lingering in the air like smoke after fire. For the first time in years, Alexander felt truly alone, stripped of the illusions he had carefully built around himself. His apartment, filled with luxury, seemed hollow, each gleaming surface mocking him with its emptiness. He realized then how meaningless his life had become, how shallow his victories were compared to the weight of what he had abandoned. The laughter of parties, the rush of deals, the thrill of power, all of it crumbled when placed beside the small figure of a girl who had never known him and the woman who had carried everything in his absence. One evening, unable to bear the silence any longer, he found himself outside Emma's building. It was modest, the kind of place he would have once dismissed as beneath him, yet as he stood there, staring at the dimly lit windows, he felt a pull stronger than any ambition he had ever chased. He hesitated at the door, his chest tight with fear that she would slam it in his face, but eventually he knocked. When Emma opened it, she looked at him with tired eyes, her hair pulled back in a loose braid, her daughter playing quietly behind her on the floor. She did not look surprised to see him, only wary, her expression guarded. "I need to talk," he said, his voice lower than he intended, stripped of its usual command. Emma crossed her arms, her posture firm, every muscle in her body radiating the resolve of someone who had no intention of making anything easy for him. "Talk," she repeated, her tone sharp. "After 3 years of silence? After you left me to carry everything alone?" He felt his throat close as he looked past her at Lillian, who glanced up briefly, her face lighting with curiosity at the sight of him before returning to her toys. The simplicity of her innocence broke him more than anger ever could. He dropped his gaze to the floor, ashamed. "I was wrong," he admitted quietly. "I don't deserve forgiveness. But I want to try. Please, Emma. Let me at least be near her. Let me try to give back even a fraction of what I stole from both of you." For a long moment Emma said nothing. Her eyes softened almost imperceptibly as she glanced at her daughter, but when she looked back at Alexander, her voice was steady again. "You can't erase the nights I cried alone, or the mornings I went to work without sleep because I had no one else to lean on. You weren't there. I was. If you want to be part of her life now, prove it. Don't just say the words. Show me. Show her." Her ultimatum landed with the weight of a verdict, and Alexander knew she was right. Words meant nothing now. Only time and action could redeem him, if redemption was possible at all. As he left that evening, the sound of his daughter's laughter followed him down the hall, light and fragile, and for the first time in years he felt both the crushing weight of his past and the faint, fragile spark of hope for a different future. The months that followed were unlike anything Alexander had ever lived through, demanding not his wealth, not his polished charm, but his persistence and humility. At first his presence in Emma's world was stiff and uncertain, marked by awkward silences and tentative steps toward a little girl who barely knew his name. He brought small gifts, but Emma made it clear that toys and trinkets meant nothing compared to his time, so he began showing up without the armor of material offerings. He sat on the floor with Lillian, learning how to fit puzzle pieces together under her patient guidance, and though his hands were clumsy, she giggled each time he made a mistake, her laughter breaking the distance between them. The first time she reached for his hand on her own, he felt something shift inside him, a fragile but undeniable thread of connection that grew stronger with each visit. Emma remained cautious, watching him carefully, her protective gaze always hovering near her daughter. She allowed him into their lives but never without boundaries, reminding him in subtle ways that his place was not guaranteed. He felt the weight of her judgment in every glance, but rather than resenting it, he embraced it, knowing it was earned. He began to adjust his own life, canceling late-night meetings, leaving the office earlier, and learning how to cook simple meals so he could share dinner with them. The first evening he managed to make pasta without burning it, Emma smirked faintly, though her eyes betrayed the tiniest flicker of amusement, and Lillian declared it the best noodles ever. That moment, ordinary and small, rooted itself deeper in his memory than any corporate triumph ever had. Slowly, the walls between him and Emma began to soften. She still carried her anger, the wounds of betrayal etched too deeply to vanish overnight, but she could not ignore the changes she saw in him. He read to Lillian at bedtime, his deep voice stumbling over fairy tales as she corrected him with childish certainty. He helped her with crayons and paint, even letting her smear colors across his expensive shirts without complaint. He learned to braid her hair badly and tried again until it looked halfway decent, and though his attempts were uneven, the sight of her proud smile each morning before preschool told him he was succeeding where it mattered. Emma, watching from the kitchen doorway, felt emotions she tried to fight off, torn between the memory of what he had done and the evidence of what he was becoming. One evening, after putting Lillian to bed, Alexander lingered at the small kitchen table while Emma washed the last of the dishes. The quiet between them was not the heavy silence of resentment but something new, something unspoken that trembled with possibility. He spoke first, his voice low and hesitant. "I know I don't deserve this chance, Emma. I know I hurt you in ways I can never undo. But I promise you, I won't leave again. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I'll prove it. She turned toward him, water dripping from her hands, her expression caught between resistance and weariness. For a long moment she said nothing, then finally lowered her gaze and whispered, I don't know if I can forget, but maybe I can learn to forgive. The words seemed to cost her something, yet they also freed a part of her she had kept locked away for years. Tears stung Alexander's eyes, and for once he didn't try to hide them. He reached across the table slowly, as though afraid she might pull away, and when her hand finally met his, he felt warmth surge through him, fragile but real. It was not reconciliation wrapped in romance or the naive return of what they once had. It was something harder, something earned through pain and persistence, a foundation that would require care to build but could hold stronger than before. As the night deepened, the apartment filled with the soft sound of Lillian's breathing from the next room, and for the first time in years Emma allowed herself to imagine a future not defined by bitterness but by healing. Alexander, humbled and stripped of everything that once defined him, realized he had finally found the one thing worth more than all his wealth. It was not the return of Emma's love, not yet, but the chance to stand as a father and perhaps, in time, as the man she deserved. Their journey ahead would not be easy, but in that quiet moment, holding each other's gaze across the worn kitchen table, they both felt the fragile beginnings of hope, a light flickering after years of darkness.